Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 7th session of the Research Data Management Workshop series. Just reminding that this series will happen until December 12th, so you can check the next sessions. So we would like to start acknowledging that we pay respect to Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So, as I mentioned before, we have still 7 sessions ahead. So the next 2 are already open for registration. So on November 7th, Mary Majumder will talk about the participants' perspective and the evolution of genomic data sharing policies. And Graham will talk about the overview of available ICE's Indigenous health data and management. You can check all the information on our website. And also, if you would like to become a data champion and if you are interested to research data management, we are inviting you to join us. You can find all the information on our website, and you can also learn more about our initiatives and the project next steps. So without delaying more, we will start the session about the DMP Assistant. This session will take around 40 minutes and we have 20 minutes for questions and answers. So we encourage you to place all the questions in the chat, or after the presentation, you can also open your mic and your camera and make your questions yourself. So today we'll have Dr. Alisa and Shiloh Williams to present. Thank you very much, you both, to be here and collaborate with us in this project. So the Zoom floor is yours. I will stop sharing my screen.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and share our slides. So thank you for joining us. We're gonna talk about the DMP Assistant and also data management plans in general. I'm Alisa. I I'm at McGill University. I'm the Research Data Management Specialist. My background is in survey research methodology. And I'll let Shiloh introduce themselves and I will then continue. Go ahead, Shiloh.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shiloh Williams. I am the product lead for data management planning at the Digital Research Alliance of Canada. I basically oversee the strategy and development of the DMP Assistant. And prior to that, I worked as a data librarian. I'll pass it back to Alisa.
Cool. So just a brief overview of what we'll cover. So we'll start by talking about what is a data management plan. So what is a DMP, as they're known as the shorthand? Why should folks be interested in writing data management plans? What's the purpose of them? I'll talk a little bit about data management in the research workflow itself. So where does this fit in with research data? So the type of data you're collecting for your research, where is the plan in that stage and what does it cover? Shiloh will do a demonstration of the DMP Assistant Tool. And then we'll talk a little bit about some examples from CIHR in terms of, grants that have asked for data management plans and look at what kind of content would go into those kinds of plans, thinking about the funding calls that have come out this year. So what is a data management plan? So in general, it's documentation that explicitly outlines the tools, methods, and procedures for managing your research data. So it's basically an explanation of how you're going to collect data, what methodologies you're going to use, and what are the implications for the infrastructure that you need to deal with those data. So it's a plan for active data collection and also for thinking through how you're going to share or preserve those data at the end of a project. We typically refer to data management plans as living documents, meaning that they can be updated over the course of a research project. They're not like an REB application or protocol, for example, that really can't be changed without an amendment, so it's a much less flexible kind of document. In this case, the DMP is more flexible, but at the same time, the expectation is that a lot of these planning will be done up front and won't really change so much, the same way that an REB might not change. So there's more flexibility, but depending on the kind of research you do, you might not, it might not make sense to keep updating it, or it might make sense to keep updating it. So just putting it out there that it's different than an REB, but it is context dependent, right, on the kind of research that you're doing. So why write a DMP? So first of all, it's useful. So this is a document that can help outline a full project. Oh, sorry, if someone says the volume is not high, it's okay. If you need me to speak louder, let me know and I'll try again. So it's useful. It helps you plan out your whole project. And especially if you're working in a lab group or with a team of trainees and other PIs, it can help everyone be literally on the same page in terms of, how are the data being managed? What are the storage options? How are you naming your files? All these very detail-oriented things that people need to agree on, having conventions or coordination from the beginning of a project. So it helps outline all of that work, and it saves time, during the project and at the end of the project. On the other hand, there's also some mandates that have come out from funders and also journals themselves that there's an expectation that this kind of work will be planned in advance, and the funders are now requiring the attachment of data management plans to funding opportunities. So the Tri-Agency Research Data Management Policy came out last year. The tri-agencies are the three major public funders in Canada. So that includes CIHR, for example. And they're now, as part of the policy, requiring that data management plans be submitted at the time of application, when they'll be outlined in the proposals, and they will be considered in the adjudication process for grants at some point. So this is part of a policy that also includes universities and academic institutions that administer tri-agency funds to create a strategy at the high level, and also down the line further, although there's no timeline or date, to require data deposit where appropriate. So there's three requirements of this policy. The main one that's being rolled out now is data management plans, and they are piloting them in some funding opportunities this year. So you may have already seen a call that came out recently that is asking for a data management plan to be attached to the grant application. And internationally, many funding agencies have required data management planning for some time. So NIH, for example, in the US, which is going a little bit further even, and will now require sort of very specific outlines of how data will be shared and preserved at the end of a project. And some REBs are now requiring data management plans to be attached with the protocol itself. At McGill, our medical REB now asks for if a research project is intending to release the data openly, so if they're going to publish the data in a public repository at the end of the project, and those data will be openly available, they are now asking for researchers to attach a data management plan at the beginning of the project to understand how that will unfold at the end of the project. So you may have different pressures to draft one of these plans from various stakeholders in the ecosystem related to research data. I'm just going to make a brief note about, where does this fit into the research data lifecycle? And so I realize this is quite a big wheel with a lot of different points. This is adapted from Harvard's biomedical RDM group. So they have a lot of resources actually out there in the US for collecting biomedical research data in particular, and medical data. But the idea being that when you're planning and designing a project, the very first thing you want to think about besides the ethics application would be a data management plan to sort of lay out everything. And that will also involve things like having documentation, having SOPs, having data use agreements at the beginning of a project. And all of those things are really interconnected. They all would, more or less be working with the same text, although the data management plan will detail each of the following steps in the research data lifecycle, which is basically the idea of, from the conception of data and from the creation or collection of it till it either passes away or is preserved indefinitely somewhere. So every, stage of its life up until the end, and it can be indefinitely. So research data can be a little bit immortal if we want it to be. But it's thinking through these different stages in terms of collecting and creating the data, and at the very detail-oriented level, like what are the files going to be named? What convention are you going to use? Is there a directory structure you're going to use for your folder system? Is everyone going to be using the same structure? Is there a standard in your field? So in neuroscience, there's the BID standard, for example, for directories. How are you going to version control your files? Will you have README documents that will explain how to reproduce or how to interpret the structure of the data and the files, and where the code files are versus the data files? You'll have your analysis and collaboration phase, where you might be working from electronic lab notebooks. You might be collaborating with multiple external and internal researchers or different sites. You might have to manage images. You might have to have different kinds of tools and software that are managed. When you're evaluating and archiving the data, you might have to think about the intellectual property, the retention of those data. Are there any obligations that you might have to keep those data for a certain period of time? Where will those be kept? Who's going to keep them? Who's responsible? Are you committing to destroy the data? Why are you doing that? So thinking through all of those kinds of phases. And then you get to the point where you might share and disseminate. So you want to think about, is there a version of this data set that could be made publicly available? So if you're working with clinical data or human participant data, in many cases, not all of a data set can be made available, or perhaps not any of it, but in a lot of cases they can be. So a lot of those types of data can be released in some way that allows for the very minimum for the article that's been written that's based on that evidence to be reproduced or verified. And all the way to the idea that someone can reuse those data for new innovations. And that's sort of what we're hoping to accomplish with thinking through this whole process, so that it's in that state at the end of a project where it can be used to support further scientific innovation and discovery. And then beyond sharing and disseminating, you want to think about access and reuse. How are people going to get to this data? Are they allowed to use it? Can they reproduce your project? So thinking through that whole thing, and then perhaps starting over again. So thinking that it's, a life cycle where data can be used many times and go through this process many times, or a project can evolve and have many components that then go through this process many times. So I'm going to hand it over to Shiloh to talk about a tool that you can use to actually help you draft your data management plan that will guide you through that process. And Shiloh, I can click through for you if you'd like, so I can keep sharing my screen.
Yeah, sounds good. So the DMP Assistant is it's a tool, like Alisa said, that can help walk you through the process of creating a DMP. It'll walk you through basically answering the questions that you need to answer in order to complete your DMP. It will also provide guidance for the process. The DMP Assistant is a tool that is created by the Digital Research Alliance of Canada in collaboration with the University of Alberta Libraries. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to walk you first through some of the resources that we have that can help to sort of help you create a DMP, whether or not you use the DMP Assistant or not. And then I'm going to go into a more detailed sort of dive into the tool and the user interface. So, one way to find the tool is you can go to the Alliance website, which is alliancecan.ca. It'll take you to this page that's up on the screen. And Alisa, could you advance it one more slide? From here, you're going to want to go to the Services tab up at the very top and go down and click on Research Data Management. Can you go to the next slide, Alisa? And this page will really bring you to all of our different resources that we have available for you to use, including the first that I'm going to highlight is the Network of Experts. Could you click on the next slide, Alisa? Our Network of Experts are basically groups at the Alliance that work on specific topics or issues related to not just research data management, but also the other sort of wings of the Alliance, including like research computing, things like that. The group that I really want to highlight here in our network of experts is our data management planning expert group, oftentimes abbreviated as DMPAG. But the data management planning expert group is a group that, well, anybody can actually apply to join it. But it's a group that develops and they make available guidelines, best practices, and training resources in support of data management planning. So they create things called exemplars and templates that can help you to create your data management plan. And also they also create guidance and best practices for creating plans. Could you go to the next slide, Alisa? So here's a more sort of developed statement of what they do, but they, the DMP expert group, they work to promote and nurture a strong data culture in Canada. They support researchers and institutions in their data management planning needs. Like I said before, they develop and they make available guidelines, best practices, and training resources that work together to support data management planning. And they also develop guidance materials for the National DMP platform, which is the DMP Assistant. They work on things like the DMP Assistant Administrator Guide, which really, if you become the administrator for your institution on the DMP Assistant, this is a guide that will walk you through the different permissions that you have, basically walk you through the different things that you can do with your account. Could you go to the next slide, Alisa? Here's a list of the existing resources that are developed by DMPAG. We do have like brief guides and primers in case you're new to creating data management plans. Basically describing a lot of what Alisa talked about earlier, and we'll talk about after this section. But basically, the kinds of information that you'll want to include in your DMP. They also create tutorial videos, which are little video introductions to creating DMPs, video guides walking you through the DMP Assistant, and any other sort of related aspects to the DMP Assistant. They also create DMP exemplars, which I'll go into in a little bit, but DMP exemplars are basically sort of like examples of DMPs, of like best practices. We have a lot of different DMP exemplars for different disciplines and subjects that I'll walk you through a little bit more later, but just good to note that at this point that we have them. Could you go to the next slide, Alisa? So we also have some upcoming resources that are coming out of DMPAG, including a DMP 101 Plus training video, an updated institutional administrator guide, which has had a soft launch, but hasn't been quite officially launched yet. We have some new DMP exemplars coming out. We have over 10 new exemplars coming out that will be covering quite a range of different research disciplines and methodologies. Could you go to the next slide, Alisa? Thank you. And then, so to get to the actual tool, you're going to want to go back to that research data management page. You can also just Google DMP Assistant, and it's like the first result that comes up, but you can also access it through the Digital Research Alliance Canada website by clicking on underneath the tab where it says RDM services we provide, clicking on DMP Assistant. So like I said before, the DMP Assistant is it's a tool that's hosted by the University of Alberta Library and supported by the Digital Research Alliance of Canada. It's freely available. There's no cost associated with using it or becoming a member of it. It's bilingual, and it is available nationwide. It helps users to basically develop a DMP by prompting with questions and guidance to consider and answer key data management questions. Like I said, also supported by best practices and guidelines examples. So through the DMP Assistant, researchers can do a lot of things. Sort of the main thing is create project plans using here what we call a template. So templates are basically templates for creating your data management plan. We have a generic template that's available for users to use, but institutions can also create their own templates. Say that, as an institution, you might want to create a template that allows users to create DMPs that align with your REB process. You're able to do that. Users can also use discipline or methodology specific templates that really help to guide them along specific kind of questions that they'll want to answer depending on the discipline or the methodology they're working with. Through the DMP Assistant, researchers can also see guidance appropriate to the template that they're using, basically providing additional information. They can also collaborate with different researchers on a single plan, so there is that collaborative aspect to it. Sorry if my voice gives out a little bit. I'm actually recovering from COVID, and I'm mostly better, but talking is still hit or miss sometimes. And users can also connect with local guidance from their institution and support for research data management at their institution, including places like the library. Alisa, could you go to the next slide? So like I said before, institutions, they can customize the default template, which is now called the Portage template. That name may change in the future, but for now, just know that the default template is also called the Portage template. They can create specific templates and guidance for their own institutions. Like I said, if they have anything, if from maybe the REB that they want to incorporate, they can do that. And they can also view usage statistics and information about the metrics coming out of their institution, in terms of they can see how many DMPs have been created, how many users there are, and more things like that. We also have a DMP Assistant Steering Committee. They provide a lot of guidance, support, and direction on the development of new sort of proposed features. So these are features that during the course of using the DMP Assistant, we've had institutions request certain features to come out of it. Some of these features include things like API integration, basically allowing DMPs to work with other systems like grants or ethics systems. Also features like reviewing and evaluating DMPs, building a DMP repository with DMP Assistant integration, DMP versioning, leveraging the power and the potential of PIDs, which are persistent identifiers. Basically, ways kind of like a DOI, but for a DMP, and also improving machine actionability, or MADMPs. These are DMPs that are able to integrate with other aspects of a researcher's scholarly profile, other parts of the grant approval process. And it is a priority for us in the next few years, making a lot of headway on machine actionable DMPs. So next, I'm going to talk about the DMP Assistant key features. The DMP Assistant, it supports cross-institutional research collaboration. It's also freely available to end users, so there's absolutely no cost to using it. It's web-based, so you access it through your browser. You don't need to download anything. It's completely bilingual. It's also endorsed by the Tri-Agency, and we've been working a lot with the Tri-Agency in sort of figuring out how the DMP Assistant can best support researchers who will be applying to grants that require DMP submission. We also, like I said before, provide guidance and examples for creating DMPs. You can also create multiple DMPs. Sorry. There's also shared access, so you can access a DMP as a co-owner, editor, or read-only. And there's also options for privacy, so you can keep a DMP private, or you can have it public. DMP is created with the DMP Assistant. are also exportable. So you can export your DMP as a PDF, text document, Word document. And they're also living documents, as Alisa specified earlier. So you are able to modify them as needed. And now I'm going to walk you through the general user interface of the DMP Assistant and how to create a data management plan. So first, you're going to want to go to our homepage, which is actually going to be it's assistant.portagenetwork.ca. But you're able to access it through the Digital Research Alliance of Canada website, like I mentioned before. And also, if you Google DMP Assistant, it'll come up. Once you sign in, you're going to be able to access an existing DMP if you've been working on DMPs before, or you can create a new one. Also worth noting that you can actually you can register for an account straight from the homepage. You don't really need to wait for like approval to create an account. You don't need to get approval to create an account from your institution. You can just create it right on the homepage. If you have a DMP that you're working on that is very similar to one that you've already created, you're also able to copy or clone a DMP. This is really helpful if you're working on multiple DMPs under the same sort of like lab, or DMPs that have a lot of the same requirements. You can copy them or clone them. When creating a new plan, you can select a template to use. So like I mentioned before, the Portage template is sort of our default template. It has a lot of generic questions, but we also have quite a few DMP templates that are sort of specified towards specific methodologies or specific disciplines. Like we have DMPs for open science workflows, DMPs for art-based research. You'll notice at the very bottom, there's also an option that says the University of Alberta template. If your institution has a custom template, this is also where you'll be able to find it. So if you were, for example, creating a DMP and you're affiliated with the University of Alberta, and they want you to use a specific template, or this template has a lot of relevant information, you can select it from there. So that we do have quite a few DMP templates. We have 13 discipline and methodology specific templates, including advanced research computing, arts-based research, interdisciplinary health software, technology development, water quality research, history and the humanities. We have quite a few. And like I mentioned before, we're also in the process of developing more. So each DMP that you create is going to have information associated with it at the study level. You can also choose from a range of visibility settings, including public DMPs to private. You can also set a DMP so that it's available for anybody at your organization to view. So if you're affiliated with the University of Alberta, you can set it so that only other people who are affiliated with the University of Alberta can see your DMP, but nobody else can. You can also create a test DMP, which is basically if you are doing a tutorial and walking somebody through how to create a DMP, you can select this and it won't end up like actually creating a DMP. It's more just for walkthrough purposes, which can be helpful if you're doing a walkthrough tutorial or workshop on the DMP Assistant. So when you select a template, it's going to provide you with a list of questions that you can answer, and you don't have to answer these questions in any particular order. You can answer them in any given section at any time. So say that you're in the process of working on your DMP and you have information about preservation or how you plan to preserve the data. but you're still kind of working out maybe the terms for data sharing and reuse, you can go ahead and add the preservation information, save it, and come back to it later when you have more information about your reuse policies. We also have in these individual sections where you'll be asked to create, or where you'll be asked to provide additional information for your DMP. We have this sort of dedicated space, but we also have over on the right-hand side guidance, which is going to provide some suggested sort of information that you'll want to include. In this case, this section is for documentation and metadata. And some things you might want to include are when it was created, any conditions of use, anything like that. It's going to sort of prompt you for that. You can also add collaborators to your DMPs with different permission settings. So you can add somebody as a co-owner, an editor, read-only, depending on the kinds of permissions that you really want to give them. And these are people who can also, they'll have access to your plan and they can work together with you on it. And when it comes to formatting and downloading your DMP, exporting it, there are quite a few options. You can choose to include specific elements of your DMP, including things like question text, section headings, any unanswered questions, and you can also export it in a few different formats like CSV, HTML, PDF, text, or doc. And you can also select the font size and margins for your exported DMP.
Hey, Shiloh, I'm just in the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip to the CIHR part, and also because to save your voice, if that that helps.
That's great. That's great. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
No problem. Okay. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about a couple examples that came up this year from CIHR in terms of asking for DMPs or DMP-like documents to be attached to grants. And I'm also going to show you a couple examples from applications that I worked with some researchers on, and they were willing to share some of the text that they put. I can't say whether they were awarded the grants or not at this point, but hopefully yes. So we'll see. That's something that we do need. We need folks to come forward with their awarded grants where they have good feedback on their DMPs and share some of that with the community so that we can understand what your colleagues are looking for when they're on juries and evaluating these kinds of documents. So over the summer, I think it came out in May, but there was I think that all of the CIHR clinical trial, anything with a clinical trial component is now going to require what's called either a data governance plan or a data management plan, but they're essentially the same kind of thing. Although be careful, because in this one, it was kind of in this funding opportunity. So I read through all the appendices and the descriptions of what was required. And it was kind of a bit buried of what they actually wanted the focus of the DMP, the data governance plan, to be, to incorporate. And so here I've included the statement where they said they want to see a strategy for how data will be stored, linked, and shared as appropriate, how they will be managed by the clinical trial team in terms of being as fair as possible. And so FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so the plan must outline how the FAIR principles will be applied. So it's very specific about what they want. And they want 3 pages in English or 4 in French. So it's quite long for a data management plan. And a lot of the templates in the DMP Assistant would help you produce a document of about that length if you were really detailed and if you went through the question prompts. It would help you put this together, but if you know that their focus is on FAIR, then you might want to think more on the preservation and sharing side, because the FAIR principles really apply to data at the end of a project when they're deposited somewhere. So that's how you could talk about my data are FAIR, because they're in a repository and they're discoverable in a repository that is indexed in Google, and that it's open access, and the files are saved in a a format that's open and that makes them interoperable. There's machine readable metadata. So there's information about the data set that's written in a way that machines can link that to other kinds of data that are related to it. And I've licensed it in some way so that other folks know whether it's reusable or not, right? I put some kind of license on it so that it's very clear what the terms are for reusing those data. That makes the data set fair, right? So in order for a data set to get at that point, the data management plan should outline all the steps that you've taken to make sure the data are well documented and well organized along the way through your project, so that at that point they can be deposited somewhere very easily and they can facilitate being fair in that way. So I'll show you in an example. So we had this one just got released recently. So it's the pilot for the CIHR data management plan requirement out of that harmonized tri-agency RDM policy. So they've asked for a data management plan to describe how the network will manage, so it's a network grant, will manage research data generated as part of its activities. They should describe what data are expected to be collected, created, linked to, acquired, or recorded. So, you know, pretty detail oriented, how the data will be documented, formatted, protected, and preserved, where data will be deposited, and whether and how the data will be shared within and outside of the network, and then to discuss any ethical, legal, or commercial constraints that may make it difficult to share the data in an open way, for example. And they've specifically said applicants are encouraged to use DMP Assistant to create their DMPs, right? So they know that the DMP Assistant tool, all the questions that are there to prompt you to think about how to respond and how to create answers, that will together, you know, create a document that is aligned with what they want. As part of this pilot, they are not adjudicating the DMPs in the final score for the grants. So basically the way it's going to work for this particular funding opportunity is that reviewers are going to be asked to give feedback about the DMPs, but not include a score on it in terms of the overall grant itself, so it won't, you know, make or break someone's application. But if any of you have served on juries before or have been reviewers of grants, or if you think about the way that grants are reviewed, a lot of this speaks to the feasibility of a project. So if data are poorly managed, or it's not articulated very well how the data will be managed, or it's too vague, then that speaks toward the credibility of the people applying for the grant and the feasibility of the project itself, right? So if you've thought through all of these things on, you know, in a very detail-oriented way of like, what's the infrastructure that will be required? Who are the personnel, the highly qualified personnel that will be required? Who has, you know, responsibility? What file formats? What tools are we using? If you can articulate this in a really detailed way, that, you know, even if it's not being scored overall, that's going to make the whole application seem very robust, right? So just something to think about, that even if they're not being scored, you will receive feedback. And if the feedback says this was too vague, this was too generic, you know, that might have impacted the way that someone evaluated the grant, whether or not they were intending for that to be, you know, very explicit. So just something to think about. So I pulled some of the questions from the just generic Portage template. So it asks you, you know, what types of data will you collect? So this, like, the language from that funding opportunity is taken directly from the Portage generic template, right? In the description of what they want in a data management plan. What conventions will you use to structure, name, and version control your files? What file formats will your data be collected in? Will these file formats allow for reuse and sharing and long-term access? So what they're trying to get at in this whole project is how to what extent is your project going to be replicatable or reproducible at the end of it? And all of these things, the way you manage your data and how you articulate that and how you set it up and the kind of process it goes through speaks towards whether that's going to be possible at the end of the project. So here's an example of a response, and I only have one more and then we'll open it up to questions. Here's an example of a response to this idea of what type of data will you collect. So this is a neurology project where they're collecting MRI data. It's part of a larger project that will use participants' clinical data for patient and scores of a series of neurophysical assessments for both patients and controls. So as much as possible, we will use open and or non-proprietary formats for our data and its accompanying materials. So in some cases, you can't commit necessarily in advance of a project to using specific formats, but you can make it clear that you have the intention to do so, right? So that's perfectly reasonable. And you might want to say, and in this case, they said the MRI data will use the Nifty open file format. So in some disciplines and fields, there are file formats that are used in order to make research more reproducible. Physiology data will be in CSV format. Sorry, someone's unmuted. I'm just gonna ask you if you could mute yourself for just a couple seconds. Julie, you might be unmuted. So in this case, they are also using text formats, right? And they're going to use the BID standard, and that's, the directory structure in neurology. So in some cases, you might be in a field where these things are standardized, and it's a little bit easy to articulate because the expectation is that everyone is doing this kind of work. So something to think about if that's, accurate for your discipline or not. And then I'm just going to show an example of this, thinking back to that funding call for fair data and, to articulate in a 3-page plan how to make your data fair. So the DMP Assistant has a template. Most of their templates have a sharing and reuse section. The generic one asks you what data will you be sharing it and in what form. So it kind of prompts you to think about, is it raw? Is it processed? Is it a sort of analyzed version of the data set? Have you considered what kind of end user license to include in your data? What steps will you take to let the research community know that your data exists? So all of these speak to how fair the data will be at the end of the project. You might have to jump to make that connection explicitly if that's something that the data governance plan is asking for. But all of these, are getting at that same kind of concept. So here's an example of one that's sort of going on that far end of we're going to be able to explicitly say the data will be fair. So they're releasing anonymized data sets, process data, and metadata. They're going to deposit it in a domain-specific repository. However, if their domain-specific repository does not have features that enable fair data, the data will be deposited in the Borealis Dataverse, which is the Canadian academic institution installation of Dataverse that we have here. So each institution should have their own Dataverse that allows affiliated researchers to freely deposit the data. And it allows you to make the data fair. It doesn't by default do that, but it has features that enable it, right? So that would be important to talk about. And to ensure the data underlying any articles from the study are as fair as possible and to allow for reproducibility and reuse, we intend to license the data using a public domain license to not reserve any copyright whatsoever, right? So that's the most open license that you can possibly use. Depending on your discipline, this may make sense or not. Depending on the kind of data you collect, it may make sense or not. So for example, with COVID data, there was an expectation that it would be released public domain, or at least, CC BY, a license that allows you to get cited, but allows others to reuse it for whatever purpose they want to use it for. And this is the explicit connection here between the funding opportunity call to write a plan for how you'll govern the data to be fair and articulating it, right? And the tool has those prompts to help you do that. And that's one of the values of using the tool, is that it kind of gets you halfway there. And just the last thought, and then we'll open it for questions, your peers or your reviewers. So, thinking about that, what is the expectation in your discipline or field in terms of, how you're going to manage your data? The DMP Assistant is specifically mentioned in funding opportunities from the tri-agency. They're familiar with that tool. Most folks will be using it to create their DMPs. So at the very minimum, you want yours to be aligned with what others are submitting and ideally make it better, right? But you want to be sort of answering those same questions. The more rigorous your data management practices, the better they are currently, the easier it is to write a robust and compelling data management plan, right? So the more you implement this daily before you get to the point where you have to write a grant application, the easier it is. Same with your research topic, theoretically. And you can also rely on and mention institutional resources in your DMP. So for example, at U Ottawa, there's Felicity Taylor. She's the RDM person there, and she's fantastic and really knowledgeable. And you can mention these resources and that they will be part of your management of data, right? Great, so thank you, and questions. Sorry, we went a little bit over the time, but I think we have enough time for a few questions.
Thank you both very much for that super informative presentation. I don't see any questions immediately. Maybe people are sort of getting things together. But one question I did want to ask is, So is the tri-agency's assumption that grant peer reviewers will be knowledgeable on this topic?
That's a super good question. I think, so they've been talking about developing some kind of rubric so that there's, criteria, and working with the Alliance and the experts at the Alliance to do this. I don't know if it'll be rolled out for this particular funding opportunity. So I think that's why they've mentioned that this is sort of like an exercise in seeing how that would work, that you will get, that they'll be instructed, the reviewers will be instructed to give feedback, but it will be not part of the scoring, and that, they'll take a look at that and see what kind of feedback is given by the reviewers, and then see, right. I think from there, see what kind of training or what kind of tools would be needed for someone to do that. I should say that in other contexts, though, reviewers are asked to do this, whether or not they have knowledge of that particular aspect. So I know, like for CFIs, for example, they had asked for those folks collecting like data to write, I think, just a paragraph about data management. So I did see one come back where the reviewers, they're domain experts, right? And this was in physics, and they wrote a pretty brutal evaluation of the data management plan. So that's why my tip of like your peers or your reviewers is really, like, it's like whatever you feel like people in your field know. And if they don't know, if there's not a lot of knowledge about what should be in a data management plan, how it should be structured, just imagine they're reading a bunch of them. So it's not, they will be able to gain some aspect, when you read a ton of them, you'll start to see, okay, this one wrote a ton of details. They seem to really understand how to manage their data. This person said something super vague. They clearly don't know what they're talking about. And there are people who theoretically collect data in that research domain, and so should have some idea of like what makes sense and what doesn't make sense, if that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's helpful. Any questions from the audience? There's no questions yet, but maybe I could afford me an opportunity to ask another question. So I want to be very diplomatic here. So I've sat on an ethics committee for many years. I don't anymore, but it seems to me that ethics committees can't sort of handle the volume that they have, first of all. And second of all, in many ethics committees don't have the expertise that is required for different types of things. Do you feel that an ethics committee is the appropriate venue for dealing with issues around data sharing? Or do you feel, and I'm asking you as a human, as a person, not as an affiliate of either the Alliance or McGill, but I've been reading more about these data access committees, who are in a sense a bridge between passing on more work to an ethics committee and being able to handle these situations. Do you think that has merit in Canada?
Yeah, I think there has to be something else to mediate that. I think you're right that's, I mean, the problem with the ethics board is that, it really depends on who is on the board and what their perspective is on that. And I would say, like, I think most boards, I think the guidelines require certain kinds of expertise, like legal expertise and things like that. And it could be something where there's a requirement for someone with this kind of expertise in that context, because it involves things like IT, it involves legal policies, it involves provincial, regulations, it involves federal regulations. It's a type of expertise, like data privacy and on all of that should be represented on those boards. And I think now it can be very ad hoc or inconsistent depending on who's serving. And it is a huge burden, because it's a lot of expertise to have that gets updated continually. So what we do at McGill is we have these sort of open sessions where we have people from IT, ethics, library and VPRI do like open office hours. And it allows also for us to transfer knowledge between ourselves. And that's sort of how our ethics boards stay up to date with like the IT policies and the, you know, and what software we're saying is vetted and secure and what's not. But it's very ad hoc, right? So I think having these kind of formal either mediators or thinking through TCPS, you know, the TCPS2 guidelines and thinking about, you know, going forward, people are collecting more and more data, more and more clinical data, and more very sensitive data. They're doing multi-site collaborations. This is gonna, and they have pressure both from journals and from funders to publish those data. And there's not infrastructure to really facilitate that in a very straightforward way that you can just tell an RV, I'm gonna put it in this repository that's super secure and has encryption, and that's where everyone is going. And so I think, you know, that is really a glaring gap in terms of, you know, where the bottleneck is going to be for this, to be honest. So yeah, I don't know what the right solution is, but I think that is something that needs to be rethought either at purely the policy level to bring it in line with these RDM policies that the funders have, or, you know, in terms of structure, in terms of who is involved in that, and whether that's two separate things or one thing, you know, two committees, one committee, whatever it may look like. But I think this is going to become a huge bottleneck at some point, if it's not already.
Thank you.
I don't know if Shiloh, if you have another, sorry, I have strong opinions about all this. I should let you speak if you want to.
No, I mean, that's my sense of it as well. I've heard that it is very ad hoc in practice right now. I know when I was a librarian, I had to sort of, you know, work sometimes between researchers and REBs to sort of establish knowledge on both ends of what a good data management plan would have. And from what I've heard from librarians at other institutions, it seems like folks from the library are getting pulled into these REB processes sort of to like consult on a very regular basis. So I'm not quite sure what the right solution is. I know that we've been sort of talking about this when we talk with the Alliance. It's like a known issue, known potential problem. I'm not quite sure what the best solution would be, other than I think increasing knowledge of RDM on REB boards is key. But I'm not sure what form that would take if we would have, you know, somebody on there whose sole purpose is RDM, because like you said, it's quite a lot to keep updated on, especially, you know, if it's not really part of your job.
Right.
So yeah, but it is a known problem, and we've been working on it with the with the tri-agencies, but I'm not quite sure personally what the best solution would be.
And I should also say that this can be a tough thing to think about when you're writing grant applications, because that's usually prior to the ethics application, right? Like you have to get funding before you go forward with your project. So you may commit to things to your funders and then have an REB that just says, because we have some medical REBs that shall remain unnamed, but who just are kind of like, everything is clinical data, nothing is research data. This is clinical, it can't go anywhere, it can't, you know, and it's just, that's it. And they're independent, so that you can't really, you know, you can appeal, but then they say no again. So, and then you say, well, I've told my funder I'm going to publish this data, this like anonymized data that's essentially zeros and ones that cannot identify any person anywhere and has nothing to do with an individual person. And then you just say, did it come from a clinical setting? Then no, you know, it's like they don't really, you know, and what can you do in that case? And that I think is going to be a huge challenge when people are making these commitments in advance to funders and then go to their REB and get blocked essentially, you know. So I don't know what the solution is, but I think, yes, having more expertise and knowledge across the board can only help in that case.
Thank you. I have a question from Rebecca Thornhill. Thank you for the excellent presentation and discussion. I was just wondering if there is any follow-up from the Tri-Council funders. It's one thing to say you're going to follow a plan, but are they going to follow up to confirm it was adhered to? Thinking of other examples where researchers put down a lot of boilerplate about something, not always cynically, but don't necessarily follow through.
So I think that's the big question. I think if they do, I mean, like, you know, as someone whose job it is to advise people on this, I want to say, like, yes, they're going to totally come after your money. You should be scared. But the truth is that they have not signaled that whatsoever. So I think I think that is a many years away kind of thing. Like, and I think they're also very concerned about throwing researchers into a situation where there's not the infrastructure to support it, right? And there's not the expertise. So what they want is a culture shift. And I think they're willing to play a long game with this and to do it very slowly. But their end goal is for people to be producing data sets that are fair, that are reusable, but they're not going to do this overnight. I do know, though, on the US side, yes, they will. So like if you have NIH partnership, you know, if you're doing NIH or NSF funded work, they will take your money away if you don't, if at some point you don't comply, there will be consequences. So I would say it's like on the Canadian side, if you're fully funded here, maybe less concerned in the short term, but maybe it's something to be like, in the next 3 to 5 years, I should get my act together, right? And I hate saying this as someone who supports it, but that's the reality that we're working with here. It's more bureaucratic and also everyone's too polite. So as soon as they get pushed back, they're like, never mind, do what you want to do. But I would say the NIH is more serious about this, and I feel like it's going to be, the hammer is going to come down. And I've actually heard of researchers getting blocked from funding because they poorly managed like analog data. So this was, you know, in the past before so paperwork, but just like couldn't supply it at the end of a grant and, you know, had to give back funds. So they're more serious about that. But that's a really good question. I would just say, like, I would be prepared because at some point the hammer will start coming down in a lot of ways. And I know if you're funded through if you're funded through the funder in Quebec, for example, they're moving forward with Plan S. And from my point of view, it's a matter of time before that hits data as well. And they kind of just decided, or, you know, at some point you're just going to have to start releasing stuff. And so you want to just be dialed into like which agencies are more serious about it. I would say the tri-agencies seem like they really want the culture shift and they're less about like the forcing people to do things, but all other funding agencies seem more like, no, this is like, we're funding you, the people deserve their data, you know, so that's where that is.
Thank you. I think we have 2 minutes to go, so I think we'll just close now because people may be needing to run to other sessions. But I really want to thank you both so much for a really informative session again. And I wish you speedy return to health, Shiloh. And yes, COVID has a way of working on us that we don't always know. So thank you again, and wishing everybody who came on today a great rest of the Monday. So stay well and take care. Anything from you, Anna? Do we need to make any? No.
No, thank you so much. It was very useful and informative.
Stay well.
Bye.